Hello everyone and welcome to The Wild Side. That was Lenny Kravitz singing I'll Fly Away. And as you might have guessed, given that song title, today we are talking about flying, and specifically we're talking about flying in the context of migration. And you might not expect this, but the reason that I was inspired to do this particular topic was something that I saw recently in the news, and that was Vladimir Putin's flight in Siberia, which you may have heard about, where he was using a motorized hang glider to help some migrating Siberian cranes on their journey from northern Siberia south to their wintering grounds in Iran and India. And apparently no one told the cranes the first time around that they were supposed to follow the president, and they all just kind of sat on the ground, with the exception of one little bird that did go up in the air. And then Putin had to come back and then do it all over again, and finally on that second attempt he got a bunch of birds to follow him. And so people were kind of joking about this, but also I guess admiring the president for helping out this endangered species. And I thought, well, you know, in honor of Vladimir, and also in honor of the fact that this is now migration season, and we're having lots of birds starting to leave and starting to come through from elsewhere, I thought I would kind of go over the science of migration. So just a brief history of migration to start off. Really, the importance of this event was not really understood until about the 19th century. And that's maybe partly because of the fact that it involves so many different birds and so many different species of bird and covered such a huge amount of space that it was just maybe a bit too much information for researchers to process. They just couldn't really keep track of it and see the overarching patterns that could kind of help them realize what was happening and why it might be occurring. And actually, ancient observers, of course, were aware of the fact that birds would kind of disappear at some point and then show up again, but they didn't really know accurately what was going on. So they used to hypothesize that the birds were just overwintering, like hibernating in the way that mammals would. So for instance, swallows were thought to overwinter in the mud or to go high up in the mountains, and then when it was warm enough again they would just come back down to the nice warm lowland areas where the ancient people were living. And of course now we know that that's absolutely not the case at all, that what's happening is that these animals are making seasonal and predictable and repeatable movements from one place to another, and this has to do with the fact that they're trying to get food sources, and they're trying to avoid some really inclement weather that might kill them. It's too severe for them to tolerate, and so they're heading out. And now there are lots of different large-scale movements that you might initially think have to do with migration. For example, if you think about albatrosses, which can cover huge areas while foraging. I mean, if you've watched anything about these guys online, you may have heard that they can spend years non-stop out at sea before they come back to land. But things like that, even though obviously they are covering a huge amount of space, it's not predictable, it's not seasonal, and so it doesn't really qualify as being migration. Another distinction you have to make is between migration and dispersal. So dispersal is when you've got individuals that start off in the territory where they were born, their natal territory, and then they have to leave and go somewhere else where they can breed. And they have to do that because all of the spots are already taken in their site. Maybe all the food is being eaten, there are no nesting cavities, whatever might be the problem. They have to take off and find a spot where there's a nice hole that they can fit into and do their own breeding. And this only happens, as far as I'm aware, once. And so, you know, you leave your natal territory, you go to your breeding territory, and that's it. And you might have to find a new breeding territory after that, but usually you're kind of basically in the same general area. And that, again, is not repeatable, it's not seasonal, you can't really predict it, and so it's not migration. Sometimes we do, however, see something that some people will classify as migration, and that's an eruption or an invasion. And that's what happens when you've got these unpredictable movements of northern birds in particular that may experience these really harsh winters that they didn't expect. And so occasionally they are going to have to leave and go south in order to find food. And there are a surprising number of birds, particularly I'm familiar with the ones that are in Canada, and but we also have them here in this part of the world. And they will normally feed on seeds, and so they can survive the winter because seeds are going to be okay no matter how cold it gets. But if it gets particularly icy, or if there's a particularly deep amount of snow on top of the resources, they're not going to be able to access these, and so they do have to go south until they reach a point where these things are available. And that's what we see with things like snowy owls and waxwings, which in this neck of the woods might come over from Scandinavia. But as I said, for the most part, what we see in migration is birds that are trying to escape an area where there's just not going to be enough food to support them during the winter, and so they have to go somewhere where there are going to be resources, and this is particularly going to be important for birds that eat things like insects, which obviously don't do so well when it's really harsh, or fruits, which might completely ice over and be inaccessible. And you also, in some cases, do have animals that will leave because it's just way too harsh. However, what's really surprising is that a lot of birds are hardier than we tend to think. And that's because, when these guys first show up in the springtime, the very early spring, it can actually be very cold. And they are quite good at wintering those conditions, especially when they have a nice interior cavity where they can all kind of huddle in together and keep each other warm with their body heat. So it is possible for these guys to survive cold conditions. But for the most part, if you do this, this is not going to be easy for you to do, and if you try to do it day after day, week after week throughout the entire winter, that's going to be quite difficult, and you're going to expend a lot of energy in that, so it's easier to just go south. Now I should mention that, before I go too much further, migration does happen in multiple different species, and I'm focusing here on birds because that's what we're experiencing right now at this time of year and in this area. But, for instance, if you go to Africa, and I've mentioned before on the show those huge movements of wildebeest from one area of another, we do have these sorts of things happening all over the world, elk and caribou in the Americas, that sort of thing. But today we're just going to talk about birds. So migration can be studied in lots of different ways, and people have used a variety of different techniques over the past few decades in order to really begin to understand migration in much better detail. Actually, I say decades, but one of these methods, banding and ringing, depending on what continent you're on, these go back to the time of Audubon, and probably even before. So several hundred years people have been banding birds, and that has helped people really understand where it is that birds are going, where they come back to when they return, and kind of the path that they take in between those 2 points. So this can occur throughout the year, whether birds are on their breeding territories or not, or it might be targeted particularly to the migration periods when birds could be captured along their migratory routes. And one of the reasons this is nice is that you get birds that kind of land in quite a tired state, and so it's quite easy to know where they're going to be, where they're going to want to come in for food and for rest, and then put up some mist nets there or whatever type of netting or capture material you're using in order to catch these guys and attach the ring. Another method that you can use to study migration is tracking, and then there are lots of different types of tracking. So radar can be used just as you would use it on, just as the military, for instance, would use it to look for submarines or airships or whatever. You can also use radar to count large groups of birds from afar, and they show up just as an airplane would show up. You have a signal it has a certain pattern on a screen and it moves at a certain speed, and so you can distinguish birds from other types of things that might show up on the radar. And actually, when you see large groups taking off, I have not seen this myself, but I've read that it looks like there's a big cloud just lifting off the ground. And depending on the size of the bird and the resolution of the radar, you can actually see individuals as well and distinguish them from large masses moving together. We also use radio and satellite transmitters, and these are things that are going to be attached to specific birds, and then you go out and take readings from them periodically in order to see where they are and how fast they're moving. And sometimes you can get kind of fancy things that you attach to them that will take other information, like what the temperature is and what the day length is, all sorts of things, so you can begin to understand what the conditions are that these birds are migrating under. One thing you might not expect is that you can actually study migration by watching the moon. And this is something that even just a regular backyard birder can do. And what you normally do is go out when there's a full moon, or at least as large a moon as possible, and you just kind of sit out in your backyard with a nice pair of binoculars or with a telescope, and you can watch birds fly past. And you can even do this with binoculars that aren't really that strong. So something like an 8x40, for instance, which is kind of the average that you might find among most birders, that can be used to watch the birds. And you might not be able to distinguish the species, except for saying maybe it's a duck versus a songbird. But you can in fact see the little individual birds fly across the face of the moon, and it's quite impressive. And finally, another and final technique is the use of seasonal censuses, and you can do these both on the wintering grounds and on the breeding grounds. And these are often done in conjunction with banding efforts and actually these other things as well. And that allows you to see, kind of very roughly how many birds show up during the breeding season, how many take off, and then how many return again the next year. And so that's not going to give you the type of information exactly as these other techniques, but you do generally get an understanding of where these birds are in the habitat and where they're using certain things and for what at different times of the year. Now, a little bit about why birds migrate, and I have already kind of mentioned this a little bit, but to just go into a little bit more depth, you have to think about the costs and benefits associated with migrating or staying put. So, as I said, the costs here are going to be energy requirements, the cost of migration, I should say. It's going to be energy requirements that go into the actual act of flight, because some of these birds go quite far, as we'll discuss later on. You've got exposure, so the moment that you take flight and you're out there in the air, then a whole bunch of other birds, including predators, could see you, and then you could get picked off. You're also leaving behind a hard-won territory, and this is one of the things that researchers have been puzzled by for a very long time. So a lot of these birds, they show up in the spring, they battle it out with each other, and we've talked about male song in the past, and the males will sit there and they'll advertise themselves, and they'll stake out the edges of their territory, and they'll call in a female, and the male and female together as a pair will defend that territory. And you would think that after having done all that work, they might be tempted to stick around in the winter and defend it and make sure that no one comes in and takes it from them again. But for some reason, a lot of these birds do take off again, so there obviously is some benefit to leaving. There's also a cost of the uncertainty of the territory that the birds are going to. So here they have this nice patch that they know, even if they had a failed breeding attempt, at least they know that they survived there and they were able to find food there, and it's a known commodity. But once they take off, they have no idea what they're flying into. They could hit a storm, they could go down south and find out that all the forests have been cut down. There are all sorts of things that could go wrong, and yet for some reason they do this anyway. And so the benefits that could offset all of these things are things like having food items that are available in the new place that weren't going to be available elsewhere. And as I said, this is particularly true for insects and things that can be buried under snow. Also, and I'll discuss this in a little bit more detail later, you might end up going somewhere that's a bit safer to molt. So there are some species of birds that will migrate purely because they need to find a place where they can drop all of their feathers and not be worried about not being able to take flight. And they can hang out in these spots until they grow their feathers back. And for the most part, the places where they're breeding don't fit that description. They're not going to be safe if you're flightless. And so they go somewhere that is safe. They might also benefit from having longer summer days elsewhere. So if you're in the North Hemisphere and you leave during the winter, then when you show up in the South, it's going to be summertime. Or if you go towards the equator, then it's going to be basically the same all year round. And so you're going to have longer days either way than you would have had you stayed put. And that's going to give you access to more hours of light during which you can do whatever you want to do, but in particular get energy and forage for food. And it may also be the case that wherever it is that you're going has a lower density of predators or competitors or parasites. And that might not be so important during the overwintering season. I mean, it could be, but it might be particularly important during the breeding season. So for you to take off from that spot and go north in order to escape the predators and competitors and parasites might be advantageous. So this could go either way. Maybe you're going to a place in the winter where you don't have to deal with these things, or maybe they're very high there in the winter and you're escaping during the summer in order to do your breeding in a place that has less pressure. So you kind of have to think about the costs and benefits associated with both the idea of staying put and the idea of taking off. And before I talk any more about the idea of migration and some of the different types of migrations that there are, We'll have a little break and listen to Alison Krauss and Gillian Welch singing I'll Fly Away.